Today I'm going to be showing you how I recreated King George III's coat from Hamilton. I'm going to be doing a series of these videos which will also cover the waistcoat and the breeches as well, so be sure to stick around for those. In the description below I'll put a list of books that helped me throughout the entire process as well as the pattern making books that I used. So without further ado, let's get right into it. So start by cutting the fabric, leaving a 1.5 seam allowance along the curves and 2 cm seam allowance along all the other lines. Then you'll want to tailor tack all your fabric pieces. This takes a long while, but it's definitely worth doing. The good thing about tailor tacking is you'll be able to keep track of your patterns without the worry of any of the chalk coming off throughout the process. The next step is to cut the canvas and felt. With these, you don't want to add any seam allowance since they'll be going on the inside of the coat. You then want to pin the felt and mark lines 1 cm apart and baste it into place. This is getting it ready for the pad stitching. To start pad stitching, start at the top of the felt, pulling it through the 2 layers of canvas and grabbing a bit of fabric before pulling it through. When you pull through the thread, pull it to a diagonal and repeat this process. Once you get to the bottom of the felt, swap the direction that you're pulling that thread so that it's the opposite diagonal to the line next to it. The pad stitching will add a nice curve to the chest and structure for the inside of the jacket. Once I finished my pad stitching, I opted for interfacing the canvas onto the fabric just so the pad stitching wasn't visible from the other side. Before running your fabric through the sewing machine, you're going to want to tack your seams together. This is because the Duchess satin is quite slippy. I started with my centre back panels, sewing them along the centre back seam up until the vent, and then made sure to press open that seam. Throughout this process, you're going to want to make sure your seams are thoroughly pressed open, just so you get a nice finish on your seams. After that, it was a matter of sewing the shoulder and side seams together, pressing the skirt as I go along. Once those seams were done, I added the outer side of the collar to the coat so that the piping goes around continuously to the outer rim. For the pockets, I added a cotton interfacing before slashing them open in a smile shape. The pocket bags were then sewn right side against the fabric and then flipped to the other side, understitching the bottom smile, then sewing the pocket bags together. When you sew the pocket bags together, you want to make sure to do 2 stitches just to reinforce it. When it came to sewing the trim on, these were all put on using a back stitch on all the areas that needed them, such as the front of the coat, the cuffs, and the pocket bags. When working with the Russian braid, I found that you needed to put a lot of force into moulding the shape that you want before applying it to your fabric. If you don't put enough force, the braid itself will start to unravel, so just make sure you take your time to mould the shape. To make the buttons, I came across a tutorial which I'll link in the description below on how to make couture buttons. To make these buttons, it was a matter of gathering fabric around the ring. So I initially started by making rings out of foam clay, thinking that they'd be sturdy enough to be used, but in the end they were a bit too squidgy and would lose shape, so none of them were consistent. So going forward, I used some wooden rings instead and gathered the fabric around, following the inside circle of the ring to create that jewel dome shape, finishing it with a golden ring on top. Overall, there was 26 buttons that I made. This took a very long time, probably more than the tailor tacking. Once all those pieces are sewn onto the costume, it's time to move on to the pocket bags. Start by adding an interfacing onto one side of either pocket bag. This will just allow it to have a clean and crisp finish. Then stitch around your pocket bag, leaving an opening at the top so that you can bag it out, finishing it with a slip stitch. Slip stitching it onto the coat to finish. Moving on to the sleeves, start by sewing the upper and lower sleeve together. You want to do this for the lining as well. Then pulling over the lining, tack at the elbow on either side, then bag it out. And finish by hemming the sleeve, rolling up the outer fabric and slip stitching it. Before sewing the cuff panels together, I ironed on the canvas, which would give it some structure. Once structure has been added to the cuff, it's a matter of adding the piping. This goes around the outer edge of the cuff. The lining is then sewn around this edge and flipped and add an understitch to the lining. After that, sew the cuff onto the sleeve using a slip stitch. Once the sleeve had been put together, it was a matter of attaching the outer fabric into the armhole. Before moving on to the final step, I added in a shoulder pad just so that it had a nice structure to the shoulder, although this isn't historically accurate to the period. The final step of this costume is to sew in the lining. I started by sewing the back panels together along the centre back, pressing that seam open. These two panels are then stitched into the jacket along the seam allowance. The front panels are then stitched along the front with a slip stitch, connecting them to the back panels by folding them and once again slip stitching them together. By doing all this hand stitching, it adds a very nice and neat finish to your costume. Finishing the lining by attaching the collar and hemming it with a slip stitch. Here is my finished coat. So that's the process of how I created the coat. So if you'd like to see more, be sure to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.